gentlemen, I would like to introduce, first of all, Liisa Past. Liisa works as head of cybersecurity business development at Cybernetica. You participated as our speaker in 2 of our events. Thank you very much for joining us again. I will have like 2 questions for every speaker, and we'll be glad to listen for your answers. So my first question to you is, how will you explain to our viewers and listeners the success of Estonian e-voting system? So 2005, 2020, 15 years already, 11 electoral cycles already. So no vote was compromised, a lot of concerns, a lot of political. What is the actual ingredients of the success of Estonian internet system?
I think it's not just voting, and all of your previous speakers, including Prime Minister Rõivas, emphasized that. They emphasized that this isn't about voting online, but this is about the way Estonia built a digital state as part of its return to the West, as Taavi also highlighted. And part of that return to the West was imagining a state, a government, and a bureaucracy that's not heavy, that's light on its feet, and frankly affordable at the time. I mean, early 90s in Estonia were not the wealthiest of times and not the easiest of times by any means. But also part of that very difficult period was that we were starting from the scratch. We were building up from zero rather than trying to replicate digitally on paper or rely on existing legacy. So we could reimagine statehood and really the fundamentals of governance in what it is, which means that in Estonia, trust is based on whether we trust the procedures, whether we trust the government, and whether we trust the politicians, irregardless of the domain we communicate with them, irregardless of the channel in which messages are passed. So whether it's face-to-face, which this is responsibly socially distanced, so wearing a mask as we are today, or whether it's digital, through email, through online platforms, that's not what, in the end, creates trust. But whether you can trust your government to be open, transparent, whether you can trust them to be working for you, as you would in a democratic governance, that's what your trust is based on. And of course, then, in this escalated digital transition of 2020, those seams of trust in society are really starting to show. And that's why Estonia has been doing reasonably well, because we have the infrastructure that maintains trust in the digital world. We have the secure digital identity, we have a secure communication layer, called X-Road in the Estonian context, but the universal sort of backbone of information exchange. And we have habit. So it's easy to then, even if you're losing one domain of communications, one communication channel, the face-to-face, the trust has remained. And similarly, we've seen that, especially when it comes to elections, in 2017, when the ID card had a cryptographic vulnerability in the firmware of the chip, something that Estonia had nothing to do with, but we just happened to have a chip in our ID card that there were 2 billion of in the world. The electronic use of the ID card did not suffer because communication was very open and habit was in place. And people understood that there was a risk, but not an incident or a vulnerability or a technical crisis yet. So that's really helped. And then that's created the ecosystem and the environment for elections that allows thousands of services. I would guess there's about 10,000 services that rely on digital identity and build habit. And ID card is just one of them. That same fact helps security, because then a lot of the security around voting online is not of technology that's singularly used in elections. And frankly, if I had the computing power and the cryptographic knowledge to figure out how to compromise an Estonian ID card, which is a lot of ifs, that compromise is not scalable. It's not even scalable for one person. You can only compromise one of the certificates at the time. But even if I had managed to get to all of those ifs, why would I steal a vote when I can get into a bank account? So that actually provides security for elections, that ecosystem. And that also, as was mentioned before, then has created a lot of companies that have an invested interest in the ecosystem and from which you can procure development, from which you can procure services. Which then means that when you look at the election life cycle, it's easy. You use technology wherever it makes sense, from the voter rolls being pulled from the population registry to facilitating voting online as one of the many ways, as you very well laid out earlier this morning, to publishing results online in real time or close to real time. So it's really the trust of habit that's helped, and it's this ecosystem approach, and it's also imagining governance, and I think that's fundamental. It's imagining governance without legacy. So how can we best fulfill the constitutional requirements of representative, free, fair, open elections based on one person, one vote principle whilst maintaining vote secrecy, without thinking of how to replicate an already existing paper digital system, but really fundamentally thinking how to do that using technology.
Lisa, thank you very much. You just mentioned the government. I think this is really important because actually in the paper we also quite, many times we're speaking about what everything was meant, leadership, political will, and stuff like that. But you know the political, how this political landscape is working. If you have just, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes, just say something very essential to political leaders from the Republic of Moldova and Romania, in order, to convince them to introduce internet voting, what you will say them?
I think you've hit the nail on the head with the question in what the main misconception about internet voting is, or frankly, any use of technology in elections that's facing the citizens. So whether it's internet voting or whether it's digital means to have political discussions. And that misconception is that somehow certain political groups, certain demographics would be advantaged by it. And the Estonian experience of having had years and elections of universal online voting available proves that an average voter is an internet voter is an average voter, and no political party or no demographic group is advantaged or disadvantaged by internet voting. So it's mainstreamed as something that everyone does. And that's very important because that then takes away the fear of, what if it doesn't stick with my voters, or what if my voters don't do that? The system itself has to be easy enough and intuitive enough to use, just as voting is, that it's accessible for every citizen. And when you design it that way, as Estonian experience has shown, it is ideology agnostic in a way. It doesn't advantage or disadvantage anyone except for people for whom it takes more than half an hour to vote, in dispersed populations in where the polling station isn't right next to where we live, which is the second point. One, it doesn't advantage anyone politically. Two, internet voting is the great equalizer in that sense. In the Moldovan context, you've already spoken about the diaspora, about 1 million votes being cast overseas at an incredible cost sometimes for the voters, either in time or in cost of travel. And that's, to what degree can you still argue that that's equal access to democracy if some people have to take several days off to be able to go to a place where they can cast their vote? But similarly, that's the case with dispersed populations in rural areas outside of cities. There's a lot of work coming out of Australia and Canada on how online voting would create more equal access to democracy and to elections for their indigenous populations that also are very dispersed and cover great geographical areas. And it's also a great equalizer for people who, for other reasons, cannot or don't wish to, at the time of a pandemic, frankly, go out and to cast their vote, whether it's people who have demanding shift work, whether it's disabled people, or whether it's people like me and you in a global pandemic where we've, having to choose between democracy and health is a terrible, impossible choice. And, it takes that away. So secondly, as I said, internet voting is a great equalizer. But, these are all the sort of grand opportunity issues. We also have to understand that in 2020, we've seen 4 or 6 years of intense meddling in elections, in campaigns, in how ways people vote, attempts to sow division and confusion to a point where citizens would be so alienated that they no longer vote. And in this context, there's my point number 3 on risks and point number 4 on participation again. On risks, no way of voting is riskier than the other, but there are riskier implementations than others. If you don't use a sealed and stamped ballot box in physical elections, it's easier to steal votes. If you don't also then create both trust measures, but also privacy and secrecy measures. Estonian internet voting, for example, mimics postal online voting using digital means. Then you create risks in implementation, not in the area of technology you use. And the digital and analog technologies create different risks and different risk mitigation mechanisms. In technology, for example, you can, in digital technology, you can log things, you can analyze and monitor much more easily. But those mechanisms to log and monitor and keep records have to be in place. And fourthly, participation, that sort of is the flip side of my first point on internet voting being ideology agnostic. The opportunity to vote online doesn't create participation automatically, and it does not increase participation, but rather it creates a new venue for voting. So you still have to reach out to possibly previously underrepresented populations, again, be it the disabled, the rural populations, or the diaspora, to create understanding. So with those 4 points, there's a lot of materials to get started. There's the IFES materials on internet voting and on voting technologies. The Center for Internet Security has put out great election security playbooks. I was part of a European Union effort, the Compendium on Cybersecurity of Election Technology, which looks at all parts of the election life cycle. And finally, specifically on the Estonian experience of internet voting, there's the Skytte Institute at Tartu University book on internet voting from a few years back that I cannot recommend enough. It has both the technical and procedural aspects as well as truly groundbreaking political sociology regarding internet voting.
Lisa, thank you very much. Now we are moving to Bucharest. Later we'll have this Q&A session. Anna Maria, welcome. Anna Maria, I learned from Romania. I'm trying to see what is happening from this perspective. We know that there are two initiatives in the Romanian parliament, one by USR, one by PNL. But also we know that senators with the overwhelming majority rejected one of the initiatives. We know that the government is permanently against. In the same time, we have a newly established agency for digital transformation of Romania. And my question to you, my frank question is, could you please explain us why Romanian politicians are so afraid of internet voting? Which kind of arguments they are using when they are rejecting initiatives? Anna Maria?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I have to agree with everything that Lisa said about the internet voting. The thing is that in every country is different. And to understand what's happening here and why the politicians are not very favorable to this type of voting is to take a little look in the back and see what happened in the previous elections. I've been monitoring elections in Romania for, I think, 10 years and participated in different discussions about policy in this regard. And the problems that we had while we were observing elections was the fact that there was a lot of fraud. And the fraud that I'm talking about, it's not necessarily about the voting bulletins, but about the fact that voters were influenced. Not necessarily coercion, but I would rather say bribe. And it has been a long discussion about this. We cannot say it didn't happen. We have proofs. There were some persons convicted for this. And in 2007, I believe, we started the Pro-Democracy project in which we went into a county in Romania and took the permanent list and the supplementary list, and we try to see if we had voters that voted twice. And unfortunately, it proved that we were wrong, and it was the case for multiple vote. That is another issue. The main thing that I would like to underline is the fact that citizens of Romania and politicians don't have a high level of trust in election. It improved a little bit over time because of the electoral permanent authority who did a software for the precinct section, and they are checking for multiple votes. But still there are means of frauding elections even now that are still happening at a lower level. That's true, but they are still happening. And one of the reasons that the government keeps providing when it gives a negative avis to this proposal is the secrecy of vote. We can agree that there are technical solutions that can encrypt the vote. But on the other hand, one of the problems of the anonymity of the vote and the secrecy of testing the vote is when the person does it. If they are not going in a precinct, theoretically, we have no control on who is actually voting. Because if you have a password and a user or the digital certificate, theoretically, someone from a party could come to your home and tell you what to vote. So that the viewers can understand, the idea is the following. The person from the party tells you what to vote, you give the proof, and then you receive the bribe. So basically, if he or she from a party, let's not discriminate, if they are standing next to you, theoretically, they have the proof that you voted the way they wanted, and they can give you the bribe. I know it's very not nice what I'm saying, but this is actually the reality in parts of the country. And this is one of the main issues that the government is not willing to do this, the lack of trust of electors in the voting process. If you add another layer, this one with electronic vote, which is we're not a very digitalized country. Imagine saying to people that now we will have the vote through electronic means. It's not going to raise a huge level of trust. On the other hand, if we look at the political parties, Lisa was saying that there isn't a demographic privilege for one of the parties, but in Romania, unfortunately, this would actually be a positive for one of the party, especially the new one, USR, because their voters are younger and more digitally educated. The voters of the Social Democrats, for example, are demographically older and not digitally literate. So basically, if we introduce such a vote, we know that the party, also PNL might also be influenced positively, but the idea is that nobody can do a math and see what would be the result. So pragmatically, from political point of view, I can understand why parties are afraid of this. On the other hand, they do understand the need to introduce such a vote, especially for diaspora. Let's not forget that in Romania, diaspora caused some political scandals and resign of the foreign prime minister because our citizens abroad were not able to vote. They didn't have enough precincts. And in my opinion, we will have problems these parliamentary elections because besides the fact that we have very few precincts, we now have the pandemic, which will increase the time that a voter is spending in the precinct to vote. So I think after this election, we will have one more argument to ask for internet voting, at least for the citizens that are abroad, if not for as an alternative for all the citizens in Romania.
Anna Maria, thank you very much. In a way, you confirmed actually what we repeated hundreds of times, that from technological point of view, this is doable. Yes, there are concerns, but if we are approaching them systematically, then we could solve these issues. But from political point of view, that's a real problem. And actually, this is, I think, not only a problem in Romania, but also in other countries. But now I would like to move to our next question, if you allow me. We discussed many times with you, with our colleagues, and during our events that it's a lot of elements or few elements are needed to implement the internet voting in Romania and Moldova. Yeah, like digital authentication methods, this interoperability of the data, trust, laws, and stuff like that. From your perspective, because you are living in Romania, you know how this works. Which elements are needed to be implemented in Romania, and which elements exist, and to which latitude they are developed right now? What is needed from different perspective? I mean here technical, law, legislation, the trust and stuff like that. What's needed to be done as the next phases? Because only to apply the laws or the project of the laws in the parliament or the Senate, to my understanding, is not enough. A little bit more should be done, including educating the people, asking people and convincing people to use more e-governance solutions overall. What is lacking?
At this point, I might say that the project that USR proposed in the parliament for the internet voting is a good one, because they also talked about impact and financial impact. We should take into account the fact that, for example, in their proposal, they ask for a digital signature if you want to vote. That introduces a new step for citizens, and that might be a problem, because they have to apply online, but you have to go to a certain place to pick up your token so that you can have a digital signature. That's one thing. On the other hand, we need to think of financial aspect for the infrastructure. You will need a huge infrastructure to handle all the votes, and also you will need an electronic solution per se for the platform. So we need to think also on this side, financial needs. On the other hand, I think this can be achieved. The major problem that we have is how do you implement this so that citizens have trust? we saw during the pandemic, and I was looking at the way the government was talking during this pandemic, is that they don't have a coherent communication. While there was the emergency state, we had only one person and one minister transmitting the information, and people seemed to be rather okay with that. They understood what the person was saying. They might agree or not, but the idea is that you only had one source of information. After the emergency state ended, we had all sorts of ministers and candidates in the parliament saying different stuff. So the citizen is right now very bewildered. They don't know what is going on and who to believe. If we are to introduce such a voting procedure, it has to be very well communicated. And what the USR proposed in their project is to do this gradually. We should start with a pilot, see how it goes, see what are the problems, solve them. I would also go there as to have a hackathon or a white hack to see if the hackers in Romania, because we are so well known for this, can break the system or not and fix the problem if they are. The idea is to increase the trust citizens have in this system. Otherwise, I don't think it will, even if we have the political will to introduce the system, the doubt in the citizens' mind will also affect the general result of the election, because they will say the internet vote were tackled with. So I think we can find the finances, we can find a technical solution. The problem is, how do you communicate this and how to make it happen? We need a very strategical plan to do this, and to do it very systematic and with only one thing in our mind: how to gain the trust of the citizens.
Anna Maria, thank you very much. We'll come back to some questions afterwards, but now, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving to Chisinau, another European capital. Mr. Alexandru Balmos is one of our authors, and Mr. Balmos is the head of IT department at the Central Election Committee of the Republic of Moldova. Alexandru, you just finished a tough job. 2 tours of presidential elections in the Republic of Moldova. It was the all-time record of participation of Moldovan diaspora abroad. I think it was more than 260,000 people voting. But also we know that in some polling stations in Frankfurt, for example, and others, people stayed one entire day and they didn't have the opportunity and possibility to vote because the paper ballots were ended at one particular moment. Which lectures, which lessons Central Election Committee and the Republic of Moldova should learn from this situation? Alexander.
Thank you, Victor. Well, yeah, as you told, we had about 260,000 voters in diaspora, let's say abroad the country, that voted at this second round of elections. Also, we had about 30,000 voters from Transnistria that voted during these elections, and we had about 45,000 voters that voted remotely from home. And this is a quite interesting figure because it's about 10% of all the voters in the country or registered in the country. Or it's about 20% of total number of voters that voted during these elections. If we transpose this figure to the all voters that would have voted if they had another opportunity than going to the polling station, then we are talking about 30% of voters, or about 60% of voters that would have voted. It's a very big figure because, well, you cannot say about a reliable, a good electoral process when you are not talking about the representativity. A big number of voters couldn't vote because of not having access to the polling stations. The main lesson to learn from all this situation is that Republic of Moldova, the electoral system of Moldova, need a big change, a change that would prepare will give voters an alternative option to vote. Meaning not only internet voting, but I'm talking about any kind of alternative options to vote, like mail voting or a couple of days voting. We can see the situation that is going right now. In the parliament, they are talking about possibility of adding 10,000 ballot papers for the polling stations abroad, or maybe extending the voter day from 1 day to 2 days. I think this is a very, let's say, local approach. They are trying to solve somehow small problems, but they have to approach to this situation in a more complex way, in a more strategic way, and to allow citizens, but first of all, to allow Central Electoral Commission to organize processes, not only in 1 day, not only starting from an hour and ending to an hour, not only voting through a limited number of ballot papers, but allowing them to vote, let's say, a week in the voting centers, like, I don't know, regional voting centers that can be opened for a whole week, at embassies for 3, 4, 5 days, during or using postal voting, or maybe printing the ballot papers in the polling stations, sending the ballot papers to all of the citizens 1 week before, and allowing them to vote. Because, you know, my son asks me, why we are not voting online? It's so easy, it's so obvious that we have to do it. I think this is the biggest lesson that our republic must learn from this. Starting alternative options for voters. Thank you.
Alexandru, thank you very much. I just have one more question, and after this we'll take another questions from our workshop. I think nobody knows better than you what is needed that internet voting should be or must be or could be implemented in the Republic of Moldova. But also our long time observation, not only in Moldova but in Romania actually the same, is that the topic of internet voting and generally speaking alternative voting methods, they are very high in the agenda a little bit before the elections, during the election day, and a few weeks after. So Republic of Moldova is just after the second tour of presidential elections. We have on the 6th of December the elections in Romania. And actually I followed this for the last 10 years. And after this, somehow the interest is disappearing suddenly. And it's reappearing in next 4 years. And actually the arguments, what's interesting, are the same. Alexander, what is needed in the Republic of Moldova? Which elements exist, which are not existing at this particular moment to introduce internet voting, especially from the perspective that in the Republic of Moldova, actually, we have more or less all the elements. We have the authentication tools, we have interoperability of the system, of the data, we have this cryptography end-to-end, we have a very efficient agency for electronic governance, which is launching every day or every week services. But actually the problem is that people are not using them. What is happening? What is needed to be done? And if you allow me a bold question, from your perspective, if everyone tomorrow morning will say that, okay, let's do it, how much time will it take to introduce internet voting in the Republic of Moldova from technological perspective? I mean from yours.
Thank you for the question, Victor. Yeah, as you said, we have all the pieces of a puzzle collected. Yes, we have all these infrastructure platforms, we have different governance agencies, we have e-governance agency, IT and cybersecurity service of Republic of Moldova. Both institutes are working with Central Electoral Commission already. We have interaction with them. We do have internet penetration, a very good wideband of internet. We have electronic registers. Everything technically is actually prepared. We need, I don't know, technically, I think maximum 1 year to create a system that will allow us to vote through internet. But we don't have something else. We don't have a vision that must come from the parliament and from the government. That vision that was in Estonia, where the prime minister was leading this process, a political party that was leading this process. And we don't have the trust of voters in electoral processes. A trust that very often is also disturbed by political parties. So they do it with their own hand. They stop these processes.
Alexander,
Because,
please.
yeah, okay, probably I was a little bit too far going with this idea, but yeah. We need to somehow consolidate around this idea, starting with the parliament, with the government, and with some specialized institutes, and just start working on it. Of course, the starting will be low. We won't have tens, hundreds of thousands or millions of voters that will vote online. But we are on a good path. Not far than last year, the law that provides these digital certificates extended the duration of the period of using these certificates. That allows citizens to use it not 1 year, but 2 years, and with a maximum perspective of 5 years. So it's about cryptography, it's about technical, to make it be available for 5 years. I think it would be much easier for a citizen to go to, I don't know, a government institution to obtain this electronic device and to be able 5 years to use services offered by different state institutes. And you know, I made for myself idea, or I don't know, a vision that actually this voting process, this service offered by state is one of the most required services that can be offered by a state. Tell me, please, is there any institution in Republic of Moldova that can say that it had 3 or 4 million page accesses during 2 days? I don't think. So this is the demand. This is the need. If we will offer citizens a possibility to vote online, they will start using all the electronic services after that. They will begin using these electronic devices for accessing different platforms. Today, they are not doing it because they don't really need it too much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandro. Dear colleagues, now we have a number of questions. We start this session, and the viewers and listeners to our discussions, please ask your questions in our special section here. We already have a few of them, and please upvote. And if you allow me, I will address a few questions. I will start with Lisa. Lisa, we have a question here. Can you all please, one solid argument, how to assure the skeptics that e-elections are safe? Because this is exactly your topic.
So first of all, and this makes me turn back to my career in strategic communications, there's always 15% of skeptics and 15% of conspiracy theorists. in any society. And those are not the people you necessarily need to target. There's always people who, for the symbolic value, there's a lot of procedural symbolic value in voting in person, or for other reasons prefer to vote on paper. And I don't think that's where you need to start, but you need to start with, you and your colleagues across the screen are the activists in the Moldovan and Romanian context. There's no question about that. And you need to start convincing not the skeptics that are on the, whatever you would call the opposite of the activist side, but the ones that are on the closest to you. And in that, there's a few things that I noticed from the other panelists that I think are worthwhile. First of all, elections are not about technology. And election meddling, vote stealing, is not about technology. I just, as I'm assuming you, grew up in the Soviet Union. Yeah. In very low technology environments, elections for those in power always came to a 90+% very convincing result. Not the result that necessarily in any way represented the will of, at the time, occupied people. So that sort of coercion and meddling is not fundamentally technical, but a political issue, and that's where we need to start. And secondly, the recurring theme, and particularly I heard it very loud and clear from Anna Maria, is that of personal voter coercion, that of either buying votes or somehow forcing a voter. The Estonian way around it, first of all, is that when you're casting your vote online on the internet, you can cast your vote however many times, and only the last one counts. The earlier ones get overridden, which means that, yes, if you're remotely voting on an electronic device, as the election organizer, you cannot control for the environment as well, at least. And therefore, the safeguard for us is that we de-incentivize or demotivate the vote buyer or the voter coercer, in that the voter can overwrite their vote effectively. And therefore, there's no point in trying to force them. And secondly, thirdly, voting is about delegating trust. You delegate trust to an elected politician for 3, 4, 5 years, but you also delegate trust to the election organizers. And they, on their own side, have to make sure that the way you can observe elections, as a person, you can observe what's called individual or personal verifiability, that your vote goes into a polling box. Now, in many places it needs to be stamped, in some places it's in an envelope, but you observe it being cast. And then when it comes to vote gathering and tallying, there's some sort of procedural controls and election observers. And similarly in digital, there needs to be that sort of way of controlling, but it's hard because you're delegating trust into complex mathematics. So with all these little ideas, you come back to the original question: how do you convince the skeptics? Well, in a way you don't, and in a way you don't also, not just because it makes no sense to spend energy on those that are hardest to convince, but because it's an ecosystem question. You don't just vote electronically, you do everything electronically. And that's the direction of movement. In fact, as a good safeguard, given the sanctity of elections in a democracy, and in another conference yesterday, or the day before yesterday, President Ilves pointed out very eloquently that this is only a problem of democracies. Election meddling is of no value in non-democratic systems. Is that elections cannot be, and particularly voting, cannot be more digital than the governance they support. Elections and particularly voting is not where you build habit or where you create, where you experiment, simply because it's one person, one vote, and it is sacred. So I'm afraid I'll have to disagree with the previous speaker on the possibility of experimenting or maybe starting to build habit with elections. I know habit gets built when I go to exercise every second day. It doesn't get built once a year, once every 2 years.
Lisa, thank you very much. I have another question which is upvoting heavily right now. It's the question about who should put the agenda of internet voting, and I assume this is in the Republic of Moldova and Romania, it's meaning in these particular countries now. So the question is, which public institution should take the lead and put the pressure to political actors to implement internet voting? And I'm addressing these questions to both Anna Maria and Alexandru, please.
Well, I can start. From my point of view, the main idea is to have the political will. If, in my opinion, now, I think with what we see as potential results in the parliamentary election, everyone expects to have a government made up of PNL and USR. Given the fact that the latter is a huge fan of internet voting, this might be a good momentum for them to negotiate with PNL and pass a law regarding this. The actual implementation can go to two institutions. We have the Permanent Electoral Authority, who from my point of view is handling very well elections right now. And the other one is the Agency for Digitalization of Romania. They could work together to make this happen. But first of all, we need the political will that will pass a law and the financial means to make this happen.
Thank you, Anna Maria. Alexandru, and Lisa would like to add a little bit later. Alexandru, please.
Thank you, Victor. If the question is correctly understood by me, then first of all, political parties must put the question on the agenda of government. They must be the first to start these discussions and to push this idea of implementing internet voting. Probably NGOs, probably those who represent the media could help in this subject. But first of all, are them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yesterday I was watching for the session of the Parliament of the Republic of Moldova. And Mr. Munteanu, one member of parliament, raised the idea to create a special group. I mean, from all political parties, and to my knowledge, it was rejected. But Lisa, you'd like to add
as I know, it's probably today will be discussed again, this subject, and probably will be created a commission around this subject.
And let's hope.
Yeah, we are waiting for this.
Lisa?
Yeah. Similarly, fingers crossed, because I'm glad to hear that no one said it's somehow the central function of the Central Election Commission or National Elections Office or whatever the exact name would be across the world. Since, yes, they are the experts in almost the ladder, rinse, repeat of elections. They take election procedures out of the draw and carry them out. But anything that's to do with this very dynamic, very sort of diverse digital world, election organizers, the election management bodies, the election commissions and elections offices are terribly poorly equipped to handle, because that's not their speciality. In fact, their speciality is to the contrary of this sort of behavior. Their speciality is procedural, repetitive, all of that, which means that it has to be, even once the discussions have started, this topic can never be parked with the elections commissions. It has to be an all of society, all of government effort where the cybersecurity agencies, whoever is responsible for strategic communication, whoever is responsible for communications, technical communications and infrastructure and digital infrastructure and whoever provides identity have to constantly be involved. And then in the case of large diasporas, of course, the consular representations and of course the ministries of foreign affairs. So it has to be a very, very wide conversation.
Lisa, thank you very much. And we have a question addressed exactly to you. I will just read it. Estonia is a great example of using iVoting, but to my knowledge, it has not evolved much during recent years. Lisa, does it mean it is perfect, or what will be opportunities to enhance the safety and other aspects of iVoting in Estonia?
Security is never 100%, and nothing is ever perfect. And we know that to be true also with paper-based elections or with elections where there is lesser use of digital means. You mentioned earlier one of the bigger, in terms of where the voter has opportunities, options, which is the personal verification, scanning the QR code that's been in place for a few years. There's talk about using, currently you can only vote from a computer. There's talk about mobile voting. My colleagues, led by Jan Willems at Cybernetica, before they were my colleagues, published a piece of comprehensive research of the risks of that. And they're cautious. And they're cautious exactly because, well, you're still reliant on an identity, and in the Estonian case, the identity can also be in that device, so you're reliant on one device with a mobile ID. And in our case, also we just redeveloped, Estonia just redeveloped the internet voting app for the last set of elections. It underwent comprehensive, both functional and non-functional security testing. Testing and audit needs to be in place constantly, not just for Estonia, but for any piece of government technology and election technology. And for the next elections in a little over a year, we're looking to introduce, and by law have been mandated, Estonia has been mandated to introduce electronic voter lists that can be updated in real time, and that would also facilitate voting online on the election day, as voting in a polling station happens on election day. So technology is never complete.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. We have a little bit more than 4 minutes, and maybe the last questions I will address to all of you. So the question, it's quite used, and it's why have voting and traditional voting become such a polarized of societies? Why this is so polarizing in different societies?
A number of reasons. First of all, it's easy to polarize people on something that they don't worry about every day, because then it becomes over-mystified. It's easy to create sort of mythologies based on it. It's much harder to polarize over bread because everyone eats bread on a regular basis, for one. For two, it's the misunderstanding of, role of digital literacy, as Anna-Maria mentioned, that voting has to be simple enough that it doesn't become a barrier. The technology itself is not a barrier on entry. And we've seen that societies are becoming increasingly polarized anyway. It's not just on voting, it's on a number of identity politics issues. I mean, just look at the current state of affairs in the United States. I mean, the roundness or flatness of Earth has become a polarizing issue, as has become, mask wearing and mine somewhere here, so that, the moment I stand up from this chair, I'll put it on. So it's the nature, reasonably removed from everyday nature of voting, combined with an increasingly polarized and alienating environment.
Thank you, Lisa. Anna-Maria, why the society is so polarized under this topic?
One of the reasons I think it's because most of them don't understand it. Lisa was saying earlier that this might be a subject that might be also sustained by NGOs. Unfortunately, some NGOs in Romania are against internet voting. So it's not your normal situation. The idea is that I will give you just two examples. We have one portal where you can pay your taxes. You can see how much you have to pay for the local institution, your taxes, and you can also pay online. And although the pandemic and all the publicity for it, it doesn't have that many users compared to the mature population of the country. On the other hand, funds were given to small, medium-sized enterprise who are supposed to be like the vector of digitalization. Most of them, their problem was that they need to sign digitally the papers that they need to submit for the subvention. So basically, we have a very little percentage of the population now who is pro-electronic means. We are getting there, but we don't have the critical mass. And it's very important, like I said, at least from what I observed in Romania, it's very important how you treat the subject and how you communicate on this, because it takes just a small fraction to start the whole debatable subject. It happened with the vaccine, it happened with the masks in Romania. In Romania, there are very many people who believe there's no corona and who are not willing to wear masks. Just because we have some influencer who says this is not true and we shouldn't wear the mask. So I would be very careful, especially for very sensitive subjects like this. How do you communicate?
Ana Maria, thank you. Alexandru?
Well, after my colleagues, I don't know if I have too much to say about this polarizing option or, let's say, idea, but I would like to come back to what I was talking about a little bit earlier and what mentioned Lisa about building habits and about accepting the idea and open the mind of introducing internet voting. You know, it's like in business. When you have a demand, you give offer, you give product. We have demand on different electronic services like taxes or different types of IDs, I don't know, papers. But the demand is like 100,000 per year or 50,000 per year, and that's why we have statistics like 20,000 of different services used by different persons in electronic way. And we have a total about 300,000 persons using electronic ID cards. And we see here a process that is needed by a half of a population, by a half of voters. We are talking about voting. 1.6 million people wanted to vote. Give them the option to vote electronically, and they will use it just because they have this option. It's like going to buy a bread. When you had in USSR the option to buy white or black bread, you were choosing from one of these two options. When you are going today to a market and choose what kind of bread you want to buy, you have different options. You need to have the options because there is this need of buying bread, of voting. Thank you.
Very much, Alexandru. Lisa, Ana Maria, Alexandru, thank you very much for this nice discussion and useful one.